The 6th of January, 1968. Somewhere near Chu Lai, South Vietnam, fog hung so thick over the jungle that pilots could barely see the ground beneath them. Smoke drifted through the valleys. Enemy fire waited in the trees. Somewhere below, wounded men were running out of time. Other aircraft had already tried to reach them. Some had failed. Some had been shot down. Most pilots would have looked at the weather, the gunfire, the terrain, and the reports from the ground, and understood the obvious truth. There were places that day a helicopter was not supposed to go. Major Patrick Henry Brady went anyway. He was not flying a gunship. He was not carrying rockets. He was not looking for targets. His aircraft was a UH-1H ambulance helicopter, marked for medical evacuation, built around a simple and dangerous mission: get the wounded out. In Vietnam, men like Brady were known by one word: Dustoff. To the men on the ground, that word meant hope. It meant that somewhere above the canopy, a pilot was willing to fly toward the very place everyone else was trying to escape. By the end of that day, Patrick Brady would use 3 different helicopters. His aircraft would be hit. His controls would be damaged. A mine would explode near his ship. Crew members would be wounded. Fog would hide the landing zones. Enemy fire would close in from dangerously short distances. And still, again and again, Brady would turn back toward the wounded. Before the day ended, 51 seriously injured men would be carried to medical aid. Many of them would likely have died without him. History remembers Vietnam through politics, protest, strategy, and controversy. But sometimes, buried beneath all of that, there is a simpler story. A pilot heard that wounded men needed help, and he refused to leave them behind. Patrick Henry Brady did not begin life as a legend. He was born in South Dakota in 1936, part of a generation that grew up in the shadow of World War II and came of age during the early Cold War. Like many young Americans of his era, he entered military service before he could have known how completely it would define him. The Army would eventually place him behind the controls of helicopters, machines that changed the way America fought in Vietnam. But for Brady, flying was never only about movement. It became a way to reach people at the exact moment when their chances of survival were beginning to disappear. Vietnam became known as the helicopter war for good reason. The landscape was difficult, the roads were often dangerous or unreliable, and American strategy depended heavily on air mobility. Helicopters moved troops, carried supplies, inserted patrols, extracted units, supported combat operations, and evacuated the wounded. The sound of rotor blades became part of the memory of the war itself. To some, that sound meant an assault was beginning. To others, it meant help had arrived. The Dustoff mission existed in the space between those two meanings. These were medical evacuation crews. Their job was not to win ground or destroy enemy positions. Their job was to reach wounded men quickly enough that survival remained possible. A Dustoff crew typically included 2 pilots, a medic and a crew chief. Each person carried responsibility for lives inside and outside the aircraft. One pilot flew. The other managed radios, navigation, and coordination. The medic prepared for the injured. The crew chief kept the aircraft functioning in conditions that punished machinery as much as men. The helicopter was both transportation and lifeline. But the mission carried a brutal contradiction. To save lives, Dustoff crews had to fly into places where lives were actively being taken. Landing zones were often small, surrounded, poorly marked, or under fire. Weather could turn a routine evacuation into an instrument flight emergency. Jungle canopy concealed danger. Ground forces might be pinned down, unable to secure the area where the helicopter needed to land. Sometimes a pilot had only seconds to decide whether a landing was possible. Sometimes there were no good choices, only wounded men below and enemy fire waiting to meet the aircraft. Patrick Brady understood this. He also understood something else. The men on the ground did not care about perfect conditions. They cared about whether anyone was coming. By early 1968, Vietnam had already consumed years of American attention and thousands of American lives. The war was becoming more complex, more controversial, and more difficult to explain at home. But on the ground, in the field, war was rarely experienced as a debate. It was experienced in mud, heat, fear, radio calls, blood loss, and the urgent hope that somebody could arrive before it was too late. That is where Brady's story belongs. Not in the speeches, not in the policy papers, but in the seconds between a call for evacuation and the sound of a helicopter approaching through fog. On the 6th of January, 1968, Brady was commanding a UH-1H ambulance helicopter when a rescue request came in from a site in enemy-held territory. The area was reported to be heavily defended. Fog covered the terrain. Visibility was terrible. The landing zone was dangerous. Everything about the mission suggested that survival would depend on skill, nerve, and luck in nearly equal measure. Brady volunteered. That single decision reveals the heart of the story. He did not stumble into danger by accident. He was not forced into the air by confusion. He chose the mission because wounded men needed extraction, and no safer version of the mission existed. To reach the site, Brady descended through heavy fog and smoke. The valley below was hidden, the ground uncertain, the enemy close. In conditions like that, pilots could lose spatial awareness quickly. A misjudgment could send the helicopter into trees, terrain, or enemy fire. Yet, Brady used the aircraft itself as a tool. Hovering slowly along a valley trail, he turned the helicopter sideways and used the force of the rotor wash to blow away enough fog to see. It was a dangerous and improvised solution, the kind of decision made by someone who understood both his aircraft and his mission at an unusually high level. Below him, the landing site was small and exposed. Enemy fire came from close range. There was no comfortable margin. Brady brought the helicopter in anyway and evacuated 2 badly wounded South Vietnamese soldiers. It was the kind of rescue that could have justified returning to base, reporting the success, and considering the risk already paid in full. But the day was only beginning. Soon, Brady was called to another area. This one was also covered in dense fog. American casualties were lying only about 50 meters from enemy forces. The distance mattered. 50 meters is not an abstract measurement in combat. It is close enough for gunfire, close enough for grenades, close enough for the wounded to hear the battle around them and understand that time was running out. Other aircraft had already tried to reach this site earlier that day. 2 had been shot down, others had failed. For many pilots, that information would have ended the discussion. For Patrick Brady, it defined the mission. He made 4 flights to that embattled landing zone, 4 separate returns into a place where aircraft had already been lost and where visibility worked against him. Each approach carried the possibility that the next burst of fire would hit the cockpit, the engine, the rotor system, or the men waiting to be lifted out. Each landing required the aircraft to become still enough, low enough, and vulnerable enough for the wounded to be loaded. There is a particular kind of courage in returning to danger after surviving it once. The first approach can be carried by adrenaline. The second requires knowledge. The third requires commitment. By the fourth, there is no illusion left. A pilot knows exactly what he is flying back into. Brady went back anyway. The wounded were loaded. The helicopter lifted. Men who had been moments from death were carried toward medical aid. For them, the difference between survival and loss came down to a pilot willing to put the aircraft where the wounded were, not where conditions were comfortable. The day continued to worsen. On another mission, Brady landed at a site surrounded by enemy forces. Friendly troops were pinned down and unable to secure the landing zone. That meant the helicopter had to enter an area where the normal protections of an evacuation might not exist. The wounded were there. The enemy was close. The ground force could not fully control the space. The aircraft would have to absorb the risk. During his initial entry into that area, Brady's helicopter was badly damaged. Parts of his controls were partially shot away. For any pilot, damage to flight controls is one of the most serious emergencies possible. A helicopter is already an unforgiving machine. It demands constant input, constant correction, constant attention. Damage changes the aircraft from tool to threat. It becomes something that must be managed carefully enough to stay alive. Brady managed it. Then, after getting clear, he returned minutes later to rescue the remaining injured. That is the detail that defines the man. Not simply that he flew into danger. Many pilots did. Not simply that he survived damage. Some pilots did. But that after his aircraft was hit and his controls were damaged, he still returned because men were still on the ground. There are moments in war when duty becomes painfully specific. Not country, not strategy, not ideology. A wounded man in a landing zone. A crew waiting for a decision. A pilot with enough skill to attempt what others could not. In those moments, character becomes visible. For Brady, the answer remained the same. Go back. Eventually, after obtaining a replacement aircraft, he received another request. This time, the landing zone was an enemy minefield where a platoon of American soldiers was trapped. The phrase alone should stop anyone from imagining this as routine. A minefield is designed to punish movement. It turns ground into uncertainty. Every step becomes a question. Every landing becomes a gamble. For a helicopter pilot, the risk extended beyond enemy fire. Rotor wash could disturb debris. The aircraft might settle near explosives. The crew could be wounded before the first casualty was loaded. Brady went in. A mine detonated near his helicopter. The explosion wounded 2 crew members and damaged the aircraft. Again, the mission became more dangerous after it had already begun. Again, Brady had every reason to withdraw. Again, wounded men remained. He flew 6 severely injured patients to medical aid. By the time January 6th ended, Patrick Brady had evacuated 51 seriously wounded men. He had used 3 helicopters. He had flown through fog, smoke, enemy fire, damaged controls, and a minefield. He had returned to places where aircraft had already been shot down. He had chosen again and again to treat risk not as a reason to stop, but as the cost of reaching men who had no other way out. To understand why this mattered, it is necessary to understand what medical evacuation meant in Vietnam. In earlier wars, wounded soldiers often waited hours or longer before reaching advanced care. Terrain, weather, and enemy action could delay evacuation until survival was no longer possible. Helicopters changed that timeline. They could compress distance. They could pull wounded men out of jungle, mountains, rice paddies, and remote fire bases. They could bring medical care closer to the battlefield and move casualties quickly enough that trauma treatment had a chance to work. But a helicopter only mattered if someone was willing to fly it. The machine did not save lives by itself. The courage lived in the crew, in the pilot's hands, in the medic crouched beside the wounded, in the crew chief keeping the aircraft alive, in the decision to answer a radio call when the map, weather, and enemy fire all argued against it. That is what made Dustoff crews different. They represented a promise made under terrible conditions. If you were wounded, someone would try to come, not always successfully, not without cost. But they would try. For men on the ground, that promise carried emotional force beyond measurement. A wounded soldier, hearing rotor blades, through jungle air was hearing more than an aircraft. He was hearing the possibility of another sunrise. He was hearing that he had not been abandoned. Patrick Brady understood that responsibility. His actions on January 6th were extraordinary, but they were not isolated from the broader culture of Dustoff. These pilots and crews lived with the knowledge that delay could kill. They accepted that speed mattered. They learned to fly into small clearings, dangerous valleys, and uncertain landing zones because the wounded could not wait for the battlefield to become safe. There is a line often repeated in different forms across military history: leave no one behind. In practice, that principle is complicated. War creates impossible situations. Not every rescue succeeds. Not every evacuation is possible. But on that day, near Chu Lai, Brady acted as if the principle still mattered enough to risk everything. That is why the story remains powerful. Not because war was clean, it was not. Not because Vietnam was simple, it was not. Not because every decision made in that conflict can be easily defended. History is rarely that neat. The story matters because amid confusion and controversy, one human being made repeated decisions to preserve life. That distinction is important for history reframed. The purpose of telling stories like this is not to glorify war. War is destruction, fear, loss, and grief. It leaves scars on bodies, families, and nations. But within war, there are also moments when people reveal courage, mercy, and responsibility under pressure most of us will never experience. Those moments deserve remembrance because they show what human beings are capable of when another person's life depends on them. Patrick Brady's Medal of Honor recognized gallantry above and beyond the call of duty. But medals are only symbols. The deeper recognition belongs to the men who survived because he came for them. Men who reached hospitals, men who had the chance to return home, men whose families may never have known how close they came to receiving a different message. 51 wounded men in one day. It is easy to let that number pass too quickly. 51. Each one was a person. Each one had a name, a voice, a history, and someone, somewhere, who hoped they would come home. In military reports, they become casualties evacuated. In real life, they were sons, brothers, husbands, friends, and fathers. A statistic cannot carry that weight. A story can at least try. Imagine one of them lying in the fog, listening to fire crack through the trees. Imagine hearing that aircraft had already been shot down trying to reach the area. Imagine wondering whether the next sound from above would be rescue or another explosion. Then imagine the sound of rotors cutting through smoke, a Huey descending into view, a pilot forcing the aircraft down into a place it had no business surviving, a medic reaching out, hands lifting wounded bodies into the aircraft, the floor vibrating, the engine straining, the helicopter rising. For the wounded, history may have been reduced to that moment. Not the politics of Vietnam, not the strategy, not the headlines, just the fact that someone came. That is the human center of this story. After Vietnam, Patrick Brady continued his military career and eventually rose to the rank of Major General. But the moment that fixed his name in history came from the cockpit of an ambulance helicopter on a fog-covered day in 1968. He had not been asked to conquer territory. He had not been ordered to win a battle alone. His mission was to save the wounded. He did. Again and again. History often remembers combat through the language of victory and defeat, but rescue belongs to another category. It does not always change maps. It does not always appear in grand strategy. It may not decide a war, but it changes the lives of the people carried away from death and the lives of every family waiting for them. In that sense, Brady's actions changed more than a battlefield. They changed futures. A man who survives because of a Dustoff crew may return home, marry, raise children, build a life, tell stories, or choose silence. His survival ripples outward through generations. The pilot may never see those ripples. He may never meet the grandchildren who exist because one helicopter arrived in time. But history is full of consequences like that. Quiet consequences. Human consequences. The kind that do not always make headlines but matter more than headlines ever could. There is another reason this story belongs in the memory of America's older generations. Many Americans over 55 remember Vietnam not as distant history, but as a wound from their own lifetime. Some served. Some protested. Some watched the war unfold on television. Some lost friends. Some welcomed veterans home into a country that did not always know how to separate the warrior from the war. For many Vietnam veterans, recognition came late. Gratitude came late. Understanding came late. Stories like Patrick Brady's do not erase the complexity of the war, and they should not. But they do help restore humanity to the people who served inside that complexity. They remind us that among the politics and pain were individuals trying to do right by the person next to them. That is the kind of history worth reframing. Not simplified. Not sanitized. Not turned into propaganda. Reframed around the ordinary people whose decisions still deserve attention. A Dustoff pilot was not ordinary in skill, but he was ordinary in the most important sense. He was not a head of state, not a household name, not someone most Americans could identify from a textbook. He was a soldier with a mission, a crew, an aircraft, and wounded men calling for help. He became extraordinary because of what he chose to do when the risk was clear. When fog hid the landing zone, he went lower. When enemy fire came close, he held the aircraft in place. When other aircraft had been shot down, he went back. When his helicopter was damaged, he returned. When a mine exploded near his ship, he still evacuated the injured. He refused to leave anyone behind. Those words can become cliché when repeated too often, but on the 6th of January, 1968, they were not a slogan, they were a flight plan. They were a series of decisions made in smoke, fog, and fear. They were the difference between life and death for men who could no longer save themselves. Today, many people know the Huey helicopter as an icon of Vietnam. They recognize its silhouette. They know the sound from films, documentaries, and archival footage. But fewer know the stories of the Dustoff crews who turned that machine into a symbol of hope. Fewer still know the details of individual rescue missions, where pilots and crews accepted extraordinary risks, not to take life, but to preserve it. That is why remembrance matters. History does not remember everyone automatically. It remembers what people choose to repeat. It remembers the names communities decide to speak aloud. It remembers the stories that are saved from silence. Patrick Brady's story was recognized with the highest military honor his nation could give. But even honored stories can fade if future generations stop telling them. And thousands of other Dustoff crews, medics, crew chiefs, pilots, and wounded men remain known only in scattered records, old photographs, unit histories, and the memories of those who were there. Their stories deserve better than disappearance. Because behind every helicopter landing was a decision. Behind every evacuation was a crew. Behind every number was a human life. And behind every life saved was someone willing to fly into danger when turning away would have been easier. The lesson of Patrick Brady's story is not that fear disappears. It does not. The lesson is that responsibility can become stronger than fear. It is that courage is often practical, disciplined, and focused. It is not always loud. It does not always announce itself. Sometimes it sounds like a radio call, answered in bad weather. Sometimes it looks like a helicopter descending through fog. Sometimes it is a pilot turning back toward a landing zone because the wounded are still there. War reveals terrible things about humanity. It reveals cruelty, destruction, confusion, and loss. But it can also reveal devotion. The determination of one person to save another. The refusal to abandon the helpless. The willingness to risk everything so that someone else might live. That is what Patrick Brady gave on the 6th of January 1968. Not just flight hours. Not just technical skill. Not just bravery under fire. He gave wounded men a chance. And for many of them, that was everything. History deserves to be remembered. And if stories like Patrick Brady still matter to you, consider subscribing to History Reframed. Every new member of this community helps preserve the stories history nearly left behind. Because remembrance is not passive, it is a choice. And by remembering the ordinary people who stepped forward when others could not, we make sure their courage still has a place in the world they helped shape. Until next time, remember this. History is rarely changed by famous names alone. More often, it is shaped by ordinary people who answer the call when someone else has no way out. And sometimes, those are the stories worth remembering most.